I just want to say it really will help if you have purged yourself of the virus delusion in order to hear this part, because otherwise people tend to be confused. So in the way I look at it, in order to answer this question, it helps to start by just asking another very simple question, which is, how is a human being, or essentially any animal or other living being, what are we made of? What do we consist of? Now, over the last couple of years, I've asked a lot of people this question. And of course, you get a lot of, I got a lot of interesting answers. Some of them are, well, we're made from cells, or we're made from DNA expressing itself. Or some people say we're made of light, or we're made of water, or we're spiritual beings, or we're energies that have condensed and are having a human experience or an experience in the physical world. And other people say we're just a bunch of substance that just somehow got together and creates a human being. Now, I can say that even though I was going to say all of those obviously have some validity, although not the we're just a bunch of substance one, but forget about that one for a minute. But that's not where I want to start with this. And again, some of you may have heard me talk about this, but here's how I would start so that we get agreement. When I think about what is a human being made of, my answer is we have a head, and we have eyes, and we have a nose. I have a pretty big nose. We have a mouth, we have ears, we have hands, fingers, fingernails. Most of us have some hair. We have a chest, we have legs, feet, toenails, and all the other things that you can see. Now, the question is, obviously, how do I know that? And the answer is pretty simple, because I can see it in myself. And I can see it in every other single human being I've ever experienced. Now, somebody may say, well, I've seen human beings without fingernails or without hands or something. And of course, that is probably true. But we all know those are exceptions. And that's not, we all have an agreement. Human being is made of those things I mentioned and more. The other thing I would say about this is, if you go into studying what other cultures, and particularly other sciences and other systems of medicine, like Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Native American medicine, homeopathic medicine, herbal medicine, etc., as far as I can tell, they would all agree with that statement. There's a general and uniform agreement that we have all those parts that make up a human being. So now let's go deeper. What's inside, let's say, the chest or even the head? So let's take the chest. So we have blood vessels, we have nerves, we have muscles, we have heart, and we have lungs, and in the abdomen we have intestines and kidneys and pancreas and a bunch of other things. Generally speaking, we refer to these as organs. We don't necessarily refer to the blood vessels as organs, but I think everybody knows what I mean. So again, we have to ask ourselves the question, how do we know that this is true? And I would submit that there's a bunch of ways that we know that's true. For instance, I've been part of surgeries and I've seen people cut open and we see a heart inside that living human being. We see lungs, we see a diaphragm, blood vessels, etc. Now, I would also say that in fairness, because as Stefan appropriately points out, and by the way, anybody who really wants to know the history of virology would do well to watch Stefan Lenka's talk that he gave for our recent True Healing conference. And maybe Trisha or somebody could put a link so that people could actually figure out how to get the download. Again, Stefan points out that the first responsibility of every scientist is to prove themselves wrong. And so you have to do everything in your power to say to demonstrate that what you're seeing is not either an artifact or has some is somehow caused by the technique that you're using to see what you're seeing. You also have to be clear, as often happens in virology, that what you're seeing is not some perceptual error. So it could be that the reason you see a heart in a person who's undergoing an operation, say on their heart, is that you have given the person anesthesia, and somehow the anesthesia creates this human heart, which wasn't there in the normal living, walking, breathing, moving human being. And so in a sense, the heart wasn't there when we were normal, and it's only there as a result of the anesthesia. That is possible. I would submit, though, it's highly implausible. First of all, it doesn't really make any sense. Second of all, you can also see a heart without doing any anesthesia at all. So you have a sort of control. You can see it with an ultrasound. You can see it with a CT scan. You can see it with a chest X-ray. You can see it with an MRI. You can even, to a certain extent, feel that there's something that feels a little bit like it might be a heart, which correlates with what you're seeing in the living person who's cut open. And so I think we can 100% discount that it's the anesthesia that produced the heart and the lungs and all the rest of the tissue, and that the heart and all the other organs actually are real and exist and are what a human being is made of. Now, again, using the same sort of thinking and logic as our first example, as far as I can tell, every medical system, every system of science prior to modern medicine has not only believed in the existence of these organs, but actually put great stock in them. So Chinese medicine talks about health as a reflection of the energy flow through the heart and the lungs and the liver and the kidneys and the spleen and all the other organs, as does Ayurvedic medicine. They often say the pulses are reflective of what's happening in the organs. And all that to say, as far as I know, there has never been any system of thought in science or medicine that did not agree with the idea that we are made of organs, and even that the organs have a prime function in health and illness. Okay, so far so good. Now let's take one of those organs, let's just say the liver, and say, so what is the liver made of? And here's where it gets interesting, because most people that I've asked, I'd say 98%, say, well, the liver is made of cells. And what they mean by that is the liver is a organ, which you can feel, palpate, see on x-rays, and it's divided into these little cubicles, and each one of them is separate from the other, although they have a certain connection. And those are called hepatocytes, otherwise known as liver cells. And so a liver is made of liver cells. Now, when I say here's where it gets interesting, I say that because if I then ask people the question, have you ever seen a liver cell in a living person with in their liver? And the answer is no. Now, it could be because we don't have the technique, we don't have the microscopic power, but you cannot put an instrument, any microscope or optical device, and have the power to see liver cells in a living or even anesthetized person's liver. What you have to do is take a piece of the liver and cut it into very thin slices, and then you have to stain it and put these toxic dyes, and then you have to shine a high light on it, and then you can see these compartments called liver cells. Now, here it's not quite as obvious that staining a tissue may not produce an artifact that would look like compartments under a two-dimensional slide. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying it's proof that liver cells or any cells do or don't exist. I'm just saying that if you want to use the process of killing something, removing it from its nutritive and energetic base or system, and then putting it in toxic dyes and stains, and then shining a high light on it, that you better prove that none of those steps somehow made a compartmentalization happen in that liver tissue. Because after all, we know that when you threaten bacteria and fungus, we know from the Bigelsen brothers lecture at that same conference we had last week, there is something called pleomorphism, and you can see bacteria become spores. We can see metamorphosis in front of our very eyes. So we actually have precedent that tissue can form compartments when it's poisoned or threatened. And so that doesn't prove that there were cells while it was in the normal living, freely moving state. And I'm not saying it proves that they don't exist either. But what's interesting, and here I should have said something in the beginning, a lot of what I'm talking about here comes from the work of two people who I consider the best biologists of all time, and that are Gilbert Ling and Harold Hillman. And I would say to all scientists and doctors who may be watching this, that if you haven't read literally hundreds or thousands of pages of Hillman and Ling, and they also have YouTube, so you can see it that way on video, then you have missed out on some of the fundamental tenets of biology, because they go through these issues that I'm going through in great detail. And they talk about over and over again the fact that if you want to claim that something exists, you need to show that it wasn't the dye that caused it to form. You need to show that it wasn't the removal of the tissue from its living matrix that caused some changes to happen, which may throw you off in what you're seeing. The other fact that Hillman talks about many times is the fact that there are now widely considered to be 188 approximately different tissue types in a human being. So we're talking about mesentery and ovaries and the lens of the eye and the heart and the kidneys, et cetera. These are all different tissues. 44 of them, to be exact, are considered what are called syncytium. A syncytium is essentially an organized structure that has no internal divisions. So it's a homogeneous structure. In other words, like the lens of the eye has no cellular component. And if you think about it, why would the liver break itself into little compartments called cells, like some office cubicle? Wouldn't it be easier and stronger and better communication if it too remained as a syncytium, which is a somehow organized tissue that has not necessarily made it or not made itself into internal divisions? So at this point, we have this question: do these cells really exist? We know in 44 tissue types, they don't. It doesn't make any sense to divide the lens of your eye, whose function is to be transparent to the light, into compartments that would apparently blur the light. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the whole cellular theory is if we apply the same reasoning that we did to the first two, what we find is that no system of science or medicine until the modern materialistic science actually believed in the existence of cells. There is no mention of cells that I know of in Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Greek medicine. I'm not sure about that one, but as far as I know, there isn't, or Native American medicine. They never talked about anything like cells. Now, obviously, that could be because they didn't have microscopes and they couldn't see them, but it could be that they were not interested or not believing that such a thing was either necessary or could be possible. And it turns out that the whole cellular theory of makeup of the human being came from a guy, like a lot of these things. The guy's name was Rudolf Virchow. Again, Stefan Lenke in his talk for our conference, the True Healing Conference, went through the history of what got Virchow to postulate that a human being is made of cells and that all diseases start in cells, for which he had essentially no evidence for at the time, and for which, interestingly, he was roundly criticized for coming up with such an anti-scientific proposition back, we're talking 150 plus years ago. But somehow that became the dogma. And so now we all believe it, even though most of us don't even know who came up with the theory or on what evidence it was based on. So again, just to be clear, I don't by any means say that this proves in the 140 some tissues that they're not divided into cells, but I think we should think about that and actually do experimentation and try to prove ourselves right or wrong with the appropriate control experiments. And if you want to see how to do that, just read Harold Hillman.